When it comes to food, it's easy to write off our choices as unimportant. But the food we choose to eat is one of the most significant decisions we make. Food is far more important than just fuel. It is information. Food directly communicates with our bodies, our brains, and even our DNA. It very clearly determines whether we lead lives of vibrant health or suffer from chronic diseases. When it comes to our cognitive health, the food we eat influences both the actual structure of our brains and how well they work. Our food choices can therefore be a powerful weapon to help fend off Alzheimer's or a quick route to a poorly functioning brain. Eating the right foods and avoiding the wrong foods can make all the difference. In this episode, we're going to cover the connection between diet and brain health. We'll find out how to eat right in order to thrive with a healthy body and a healthy brain. And we'll see how a healthy diet can help prevent Alzheimer's disease. I'm Dr. David Perlmutter, and this is Alzheimer's, the Science of Prevention. In previous episodes, we've learned that not only is Alzheimer's on the rise, but it is in fact a disease for which there is no meaningful treatment. More importantly, we've discovered the empowering notion that in many cases, our genes are not our destiny. And this important truth absolutely applies when it comes to Alzheimer's disease. We've already introduced some of the important tools available to you to reduce your risk, such as engaging in exercise, avoiding various toxins in the environment, getting better sleep, and doing your best to reduce your risk for type 2 diabetes. We've also learned about the detrimental effects of inflammation and the importance of minimizing it when it comes to brain health. Recent science has revealed that our diets play a direct role in determining levels of inflammation in the human body. And as we will see in this episode, our modern Western diet can dramatically increase inflammation. When we eat lots of processed foods like refined carbohydrates and sugars and don't eat enough healthy fiber and fats, our bodies and our brains pay a hefty price. Unfortunately, most Americans are in fact consuming this very diet on a daily basis. This is a major issue when it comes to Alzheimer's disease.
The problem today is that so many people base their diet on industrially prepared foods, which have the worst of almost every imaginable dietary component. When we process carbohydrates, we pull out the starch, which is just sugar in a long chain, or we pull out the sugar itself. We eliminate the fiber. We throw away these precious micronutrients and phytochemicals, and we get the worst of all possibilities. That puts a big stress on our metabolism. Over time, this highly processed diet takes a toll, leads to, over time, rising insulin resistance, chronic inflammation, and then, for too many people, development of type 2 diabetes, which we know about, and type 3 diabetes, which affects the brain and sets the stage for Alzheimer's.
We start our mornings with a glass of orange juice and a bowl of oatmeal. We have a granola bar to hold us over between breakfast and lunch because we're starving in between breakfast and lunch because of the high glycemic carbs that we ate just after waking up. And then at lunch, we're eating, either the sandwich or the wrap or the rice bowl. In between then and dinner, we have that late afternoon coffee filled with sugar to, keep our energy levels up. Perhaps some modern cultivated fruit like a super starchy banana, another granola bar, a cookie perhaps. And then for dinner, we go all out on the pasta, maybe another rice bowl, a sandwich, or even foods that don't seem quite as starchy, like barbecue, which is, a high protein food, but we slather it in, sauces today made with high fructose corn syrup. So it's just like we're being inundated at every minute of the day with high glycemic sugars and carbohydrates, and that keeps that ancient hormone insulin chronically elevated throughout the day. It's a growth hormone, so it contributes to adiposity, which is the scientific term for fatness, but it also might wreak havoc on the brain, contributing to brain insulin resistance, which is now considered, one of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease.
Two signature ingredients of a modern diet that cause inflammation are the refined carbohydrates, sugar, flour, processed cereal foods, and fruit juices, things like that, and the refined vegetable oils, soybean, sunflower oil, etc. Both of those are very powerful promoters of inflammation, and those ingredients are in almost every processed food in the grocery store. For most of us, we have grown up with a very unhealthy relationship to food. It's because of our food environment, the kinds of foods we've been surrounded with, that we've been told are good for us, or that we haven't realized we needed to worry about. Those foods create unhealthy patterns inside of us, in our brains and our bodies. So they not only they damage our metabolism, but some of them are very addictive. The refined carbohydrates are incredibly addictive. It's really hard to stop eating those, but it's really, really important. It's really like trying to break a serious addiction in many cases. Sugar has been found to be as addictive as cocaine. So it's not an easy thing to do. A lot of people simply can't stop cold turkey without support and education and trying more than once.
My favorite research is research that was done at the Weizmann Institute in Israel, and it relates to the problem of obesity and yo-yo dieting. Once you start, you go on a diet. If you're overweight, you go on a diet, you lose weight. You go off the diet, you gain the weight back. Next time you try to do it, or maybe the third or the fifth time or the 10th time that you do it, it just gets harder and harder to lose the weight. That's yo-yo dieting. You keep ratcheting up. Each time you go off the diet, you gain more weight. It gets harder to lose it. A big problem in the industrialized world is that people have lost their taste for the nuances in food. We are so overwhelmed by the sugar and the salt and the fat that is added to food that that's about all we can taste in the food. It's kind of like you're so used to listening to heavy metal that when you hear a string quartet, you don't hear anything. That's the effect of the Western diet on our taste buds.
This type of poor diet is directly associated with Alzheimer's. But how exactly might our food choices contribute to our risk for this disease? Let's take a deeper look into the mechanisms underlying how a poor diet can be so harmful, and also how eating a healthful diet can be so healing for the brain. To understand why diet is so critical for the brain and its function, there are a few main concepts you need to understand. Among the most important of these ideas is the way in which different carbohydrates and fats affect the brain. When it comes to carbohydrates, or carbs, we know that it is not only important to be intentional about the amount of carbs we consume, it turns out that it is the type of carbs that we eat that really matters more in terms of brain health and function. Rapidly digested simple carbs have a profound effect on blood sugar, and nutrition researchers have actually devised a way to measure how rapidly a particular food raises blood sugar. This is called the glycemic index. Foods that cause a rapid rise in blood sugar, such as white bread and sodas, have a very high glycemic index. For good health, we want to prioritize foods that have a much lower glycemic index because they are digested more slowly and therefore keep blood sugar levels steadier. A great example of low glycemic index carbs is above ground leafy vegetables. And in addition to determining how rapidly foods raise blood sugar, researchers have also devised a way to measure the overall impact that foods have on blood sugar over time. This is called the glycemic load. Glycemic load incorporates the glycemic index, but also factors in the amount of carbohydrates in a food to give you a better sense as to how a particular meal will affect your blood sugar. To keep these things simple, we want to be consuming foods that have a low glycemic index and a low glycemic load. Foods that are low on the glycemic index and glycemic load scale are also good for our microbiomes, the collection of microbes and their genetic material that live within our bodies, which is closely tied to the health of our brain and indeed our entire bodies. We will learn much more about this fascinating connection between our microbiomes and our brains in episode 7. But for now, let's take a deep dive and learn how diets high in sugar and simple carbohydrates are really bad for the brain.
So when we eat refined sugars, say in sodas or in
baked goods or in the form of, just simple sugar on the table that we add in everything. Everything has sugar. When we avoid that, we actually avoid these incredible rapid spikes in the amount of glucose that enters into our circulation. So everybody tries to vilify carbs, but there are good carbs. There's a difference between carbs. There are good carbs and then there are bad carbs. Good carbs are the complex carbohydrates that are bound with fiber, that are bound with micronutrients in your gut, and it slowly, incredibly slowly releases a steady flow of glucose. Those are the low glycemic kind of foods. The high glycemic kind of foods are the simple sugars and the processed foods like sodas and donuts that rapidly goes up into your circulation, and the body goes into a frenzy and the brain doesn't know how to use it. And that's what develops a lot of inflammation in the brain. It causes the production of a lot of oxidative byproducts. These are like acid and damage the walls of the cells, the walls of the arteries. And so there's a lot of dysfunction in the brain. And what does that represent as? It represents itself as fogginess, not being able to remember things very well, lack of coordination. And over a long period of time, it actually causes damage to the brain cells and to the arteries of the brain cells to the point where people develop vascular dementia. They develop strokes where, half of your body is paralyzed, or you can't see, or you can't speak. It's not magical. It's these incremental amount of simple sugars that continue to cause damage to the arteries in the brain, and it completely disrupts the normal functioning of the brain.
A major determinant of chronic disease risk at any body weight is the amount and type of carbohydrates. Not all carbohydrates are bad. Some digest slowly, contain many protective plant substances, including fiber, which will be good for the microbiome of the gut. By far and away, the greatest risk factor for type 2 diabetes is obesity. The most important dietary factors relating to type 2 diabetes risk is the processed carbohydrates in our diet now. Not just added sugar, but white bread, white rice, potato products. And what's the mechanism there? The more processed carbohydrates we eat, the higher the insulin levels in the body go, and insulin itself can cause insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction. But closely related to that is chronic inflammation.
If you eat too many of the wrong sugars too often, the refined carbohydrates like processed sugar, flour, fruit juice, processed cereal products, those cause very big blood sugar spikes and crashes throughout the day, not just in the body, but also in the brain. So you definitely want to avoid those refined carbohydrates, and they're in pretty much every food product in the grocery store, even some of that we think of as healthy, like energy bars.
The foods that tend to provoke inflammation start with sugar and with a concept called glycemic load. The glycemic index of a food is the likelihood that that food is going to raise your blood sugar. Glycemia or glycemic refers to an increase in blood sugar after eating a meal. And the total load of foods that raise blood sugar, which is glycemic load for any meal, that is strongly associated with an increase in inflammation in the body.
High carbohydrate diets can contribute to weight gain for a number of reasons, but mainly by jacking up the hormone insulin and keeping it elevated, especially chronically. One of insulin's primary roles is inhibiting lipolysis, inhibiting the breakdown of fat. If you want to lose body fat and you have chronically high insulin, you cannot release fat from the fat cells. That's what insulin does. It's like a security guard that stands outside that fat cell and keeps the fat in. So that's how it hinders weight loss. How it can contribute to weight gain is that it's a storage hormone. Carbohydrate affects blood glucose, and insulin tends to respond to the blood glucose level. So when we eat a lot of carbs, it raises the blood sugar and the insulin.
Now we understand how sugar and high glycemic foods cause inflammation, which increases our risk for Alzheimer's disease. And knowing this, many people instead opt for artificial sweeteners. But these are not the answer, I assure you. And as we will explore in more detail in episode 11, these sweeteners can actually be incredibly damaging to our microbiomes and have been associated not only with weight gain, but with increased risk for type 2 diabetes. As such, I strongly recommend that you do your very best to avoid these artificial sweeteners. We've covered the essential information you need to know about carbohydrates. Now let's turn to fats. Just like when we were discussing carbohydrates, we know that it is not only important to be intentional about the amount of fat that we consume, but perhaps more importantly, the type of fats that we eat, since both of these things are critical. Let's find out why. You've talked quite a bit about dietary fat. In fact, you wrote a book called Eat Fat, Get Thin, and you really indicate that to a significant degree, some of our illnesses, including Alzheimer's, has to do with the type of fat that we are consuming. Can you explain that?
Absolutely. When people say you're a fathead, that's actually true. And we know that certain fats are really beneficial for the brain. For example, omega-3 fats are critical for the chemical transmissions that happen, for regulating inflammation, for developing brain function, and help activate all these healing mechanisms in the brain. We know that saturated fat may be very stabilizing because it's a very stable fat that makes up cell membranes and it makes them less likely to be injured. And we know, for example, that people who consume higher levels of saturated fat have much lower risk of stroke, for example. So we know that this boogeyman of saturated fat may not be the boogeyman when it comes to the brain. Even the heart, it turns out. It's not that there's a diet that's good for your heart, that's bad for your brain, and vice versa. There's actually a way of eating that's good for all your body systems.
So to be clear, if diabetes and obesity are strongly related to Alzheimer's risk, and those two things are related to our dietary choices as one example, then our dietary choices strongly relate to our risk for Alzheimer's.
Absolutely. And there are, of course, other factors that play into this. But arguably, the most important of all is dietary choices. You want to have, whether you use oil, whatever you like to do, you want to get good fats from avocado, from polyunsaturated oils and things like that to give you the appropriate fuel for your brain.
The oils and fats that people should generally avoid for brain health are the unnatural ones. So all of the vegetable oils, which you would never find in nature if you're just walking around in the world, they don't exist. They have to be manufactured in a factory. Think how much processing needs to go into turning a pile of canola beans into a bottle of oil. So the natural fats that exist in the world as is are the animal fats, believe it or not, the fats from the fruits of plants. So avocado oil, olive oil, palm fruit oil, coconut oil, these types of oils you would come across in nature. So those are the ones, believe it or not, the animal fats and the plant fats, even the saturated plant fats like coconut oil, those are the healthiest for the brain.
Trans fats are another problematic but common component of the Western diet that we all need to avoid. These trans fats are unnatural, they're processed fats that trigger inflammation in the body and in the brain. Trans fats are becoming less and less common, gratefully, in our food system, but we still need to be vigilant about avoiding them. When we eat healthy fats, our brains are getting an incredibly healthful source of fuel. A brain smart diet starts with eating the right types and amounts of carbs and fats. The right types of carbs are the unprocessed, low glycemic, fibrous carbs, like leafy greens, asparagus, and low sugar fruits, like berries. The right type of fats are the naturally occurring fats like avocados, olives, and olive oil, nuts and seeds, as well as specific types of fatty fish. Grass-fed meat can also provide some good fats if you choose to eat animal products. In addition to eating the right types of carbs and fats, let's look at other ways we can improve our diets to help prevent Alzheimer's disease. There are a lot of practical steps you can take to start eating a healthier diet today. Remember, all of the wonderful benefits of eating a healthy diet, such as keeping inflammation low, insulin levels steady, and energy levels constant, can all play a role in helping to prevent Alzheimer's disease. Let's review the best way to eat for brain health so that you can take action today.
First dietary intervention is just cut out all the junk food. Cut out so much of what makes the American diet the standard American diet. Go to fresh, whole foods, vegetables, fruits, and then good sources of protein. But stay away from the snacks and the processed foods. That's just the first step. That's not going to get you all the way to where you need to go for optimal health, but it is a foundation. An ideal plate will vary depending on whether your diet is vegan ovo-vegetarian, paleo. So there's not one ideal plate, but it will always include vegetables. And in terms of the volume, about twice as much vegetables as everything else. Characteristics of that diet are that it should be dense in nutrients and very low in what we'll call empty calories, added sugar, added fat, foods that supply calories without nutrients, or foods that tend to raise blood sugar. Vegetables, fruits, diets that are high in bioflavonoids and carotenoids, those are plant-derived chemicals, often very colorful, so they make your diet colorful. Those have well-documented anti-inflammatory effects.
You want to feed your brain the nutrients that it needs to grow new brain cells, healthy new brain cells, and also fend off from the many insults thrown at it by the modern world. So cruciferous vegetables, dark leafy greens, low sugar fruits like avocados and berries. These are some of the healthiest foods that are available in your supermarket. Grass-fed beef, eggs.
Water is really important for brain health, and that's because really the brain is 80% water. Whenever you look on the internet, you'll get that the brain is 50% fat and 50% protein and this and that, but in reality, a brain that is alive is 80% water. If you take the water out, then yes, there's 50% fat, but a real brain is mostly water. And that's really important because every single chemical reaction that takes place inside the brain needs water to occur. Energy production, synthesis of neurotransmitters, literally anything that takes place inside the brain needs water as a substrate. And that means that the brain is the organ that is most sensitive to dehydration. So even minimal dehydration, like a 2% water loss in the brain, can really trigger neurological symptoms like brain fog, dizziness, confusion, memory slippage. And brain scans show that there's also brain shrinkage associated with dehydration that can be easily reversed by just drinking more water. Usually my number one tip for a healthy brain in terms of foods to eat or avoid is to just avoid processed food. But really, processed foods should not be part of anybody's diet for anybody who's concerned about Alzheimer's prevention.
We want to start with diet. And the place to do that is by reducing the processed carbohydrates that flooded our diet during the low-fat years. Sugar, but also the refined starchy foods. Replace those fast-digesting carb calories with nutritious and delicious high-fat foods, such as nuts, nut butters, avocado, olive oil, real dark chocolate. Get an adequate amount of protein, not too much or too little, and this is going to vary based on your individual needs, which can also be from plant sources. And have an abundance of non-starchy vegetables, which you can either cook or dress with some of these high-fat foods, making it a win-win.
So highly processed foods have high calorie and they're very low in nutrients that are good for the body. Calorie dense, nutrient sparse. It's easily available everywhere, and it's very important for people to be able to know what they look like and where they are and how to avoid them. When we eat a highly processed food, it's usually very high in simple sugars, in simple carbohydrates, in unhealthy fats, and salt. Those are the things that damage the connections between brain cells. They damage the arteries, which are the highways of how nutrients are carried to the brain. And this inflammation and this oxidation and this dysregulation in glucose and fat metabolism destroy brain cells. On the contrary, when you eat an unprocessed food, when you eat, say, unprocessed plants, they're low in calorie, they're very high in nutrients. And so you get fiber and you get vitamins and you get the great kinds of proteins and the carbohydrates that make those connections between your brain cells, that actually provide the raw material for your brain cells and the arteries to function in a normal way. And one of the easiest things that you can do is to start cutting down on processed foods, because the results are immediate. You get to see a reversal in your insulin resistance, in your cholesterol, and in blood sugar spikes.
The optimal diet for brain health really, to some extent, needs to be personalized, but should involve a degree of carbohydrate restriction from the classical standard American diet that optimizes the person's blood glucose and prevents wild fluctuations in blood glucose and blood insulin. Most low-carb diets have little or no risk associated with them.
The broad stroke recommendations are decreasing sugar consumption as well as intake of processed foods and refined carbohydrates, and instead choosing healthy carbs and healthy fats. With this said, there are several specific dietary approaches that are great for the brain. One thing that's common to all of these is an emphasis on plants. Vegetables are the cornerstone of a healthy diet. Let's learn about the wonderful brain benefits of a whole food, plant-based approach.
When you eat plants, you eat more than 8,000 types of polyphenols. These are the colored compounds that are in plants, whether they're the greens and the berries and the whole grains. And you eat resistant starches, and you eat soluble starches, which keep feeding your good gut bacteria, and they produce the necessary chemicals and the hormones that build your brain. So a whole food plant-based diet is important for so many reasons. For managing the vascular risk factors that cause brain diseases, and also providing the necessary fuels, whether it's minerals, vitamins, the good kind of proteins, the good kind of carbohydrates for the brain to thrive. A whole food plant-based diet, or a diet that is mostly unprocessed plant, is great for the brain. But even in that kind of a diet, there's certain things that stand out as being extremely brain healthy, and these are greens. Greens are one of the healthiest foods on the planet. Why? Because they have the necessary anti-inflammatories and antioxidants that fight against inflammation and oxidation. Then comes berries. Berries again have a lot of polyphenols and nutrients and vitamins that fight against inflammation and oxidation. And beans are the cornerstone of longevity.
Another dietary idea that's getting a lot of interest these days is the so-called ketogenic diet. So let's explore where the ketogenic diet fits into all of this discussion.
Ketones are byproducts of fat metabolism, but they can be elevated in the body by ketogenic fats. Fats are a critical and key macronutrient for giving our bodies energy. And I would take it one step further and say the body, in particular the heart and skeletal muscle, run most efficiently when using fat as an energy source. So having a robust source of fat in the diet and getting our body fat adapted, which means transitioning our metabolism from a glucose or carbohydrate-based metabolism to being adapted to metabolize and utilize fat more efficiently, can be advantageous for exercise performance and also for our brains.
The ketogenic diet is certainly very popular these days. Why is that such a good thing for the brain?
Well, the ketogenic diet has been around for a long time. In fact, it's been pioneered in medicine to treat epilepsy when no drugs would work. So if you're having seizures and nothing works, they use a ketogenic diet. We're learning now that it also has beneficial effects on many other brain problems: brain cancer, autism, Parkinson's, and Alzeimer's. So the body has two alternate fuel systems, a backup fuel system. We have sugar we can run on, we can also run on fat. And it turns out that running on fat is much cleaner than running on, for example, it's like coal versus solar energy. A very different way the body runs through using fats. And it turns out that it activates so many healing mechanisms. It reverses insulin resistance, it increases stem cell production, increases muscle mass, bone density, increases brain function and cognitive function, has tremendous benefits as a therapy in people who already have pre-dementia or dementia.
What we recommend to people, though, is what we call the brain food pyramid. Our approach we call Keto Flex 12-3. And it's simple because, number one, we'd like to get you into mild ketosis. It's flexitarian, so if you want to be a vegetarian or vegan, fine. But if you want to have some meat, fine. Meat is a condiment. And then The 12-3, you want to have a minimum of 12 hours of fasting between finishing dinner and starting your next meal, be it breakfast, brunch, or lunch. And then you want to have 3 hours between finishing your dinner and going to bed.
There are a number of studies now that have shown that ketogenic diet can improve brain health, both in mice and some early studies in humans. So it's very interesting. And the reason for that, we believe, is the rewiring of the brain metabolism. So the brain is now forced to utilize ketone bodies as well as sugar for fuel, and we believe that that transition can sort of reprogram the brain to function differently and maybe to function better, and that's the evidence.
In that ketones seem to be good for the brain, what else can a person do to increase their ketones from time to time, aside from fasting?
Well, I think the most important thing in inducing mild ketone or ketosis increase is to lower glucose intake in your diet. Well, where does glucose come from? It comes obviously from sugar, but it also comes from time-release sugar, which are carbohydrates. And the more the carbohydrate source is been refined, the more available that glucose is to go in the bloodstream and prevent the buildup then of ketones, because your body will preferentially use glucose before it starts to go into metabolism of fat. So what that would mean is limiting particularly simple carbohydrate and refined carbohydrate intake and minimum amounts of long-chain unrefined carbohydrates so that you are inducing the body to go into fat metabolism.
I think if you can transition rapidly into the ketogenic diet from eating high carb to high fat, low carb, and you're comfortable with that, I think the faster you get into ketosis, maybe the more benefits you get. And even the stress that your body goes through to get into a state of ketosis kicks on adaptive mechanisms that help us adapt faster. And one way to ease that transition is to use things like coconut oil or medium chain triglycerides, or now we have ketone supplements, and that can help give the brain a source of energy as it's essentially withdrawing from the glucose that it was getting from a high carb diet.
With the approach that I've taken to help empower women hormonally is to really work on those plant-based micronutrients, the low carbohydrate grains, and herbs and spices that can help with digestion and detoxification, to add that into a healthy ketogenic diet. So the healthy fats and the healthy proteins, so that we're getting good amounts of that for hormone balancing. So we need healthy fats for healthy hormones, and that's an important distinction. But also we need those nutrients to balance our hormones. And when we have that combination as women, we do really, really well. We get that clarity and improve cognitive function.
You're talking about the ketogenic diet. Some people don't feel well on the ketogenic diet. What are they doing wrong?